Welcome to Borneo's first and only conservation-themed podcast series. So my name is Shavez and I'm the founder of 1StopBorneo Wildlife. In these podcast episodes, we'll be highlighting the work of many great conservationists who call Borneo home. So today, our first guest for the series is John Payne. He's a man who I really look up to, and he will share with you all his life story, and also he will talk about the Sumatran Rhinoceros in this episode. Hi, John.
Hi.
Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Nice to meet you.
Me.
Yes, good to see you here on this lovely afternoon. We see each other all the time. That's good. So, John, could you tell me a little bit more about yourself so the people out there can know who you are and so on?
I'm British. I've lived in Malaysia now for 50 years. I'm a wildlife biologist. I consider myself really very fortunate because when I started my working life in Malaysia in 1975, I thought I was unique in the world. You can imagine it was pre-digital days. So I was passionate about wildlife in the tropics, and I got a scholarship from Cambridge University to study wildlife in Pahang, Malaysia. And I did, and I've been here ever since. But I've retained that passion for wildlife. All of my working life, one way or another, has been to do with management and conservation of wild species in Malaysia.
Nice. So let's talk about the rhino in the room, not the elephant in the room. What made you interested in rhinos?
I became interested seriously in the Sumatran rhino in the late 1970s. First thing was, at that time, there was a proposal, mainly from an NGO, Malaysian Nature Society, to have a new protected area in Malaysia, which subsequently became the Endar Rompin State Park. And one of the arguments, justifications at that time, for creating a new protected area in Malaysia was it had the last big population of Sumatran rhinos. As it turned out, that wasn't really true, but it was an important argumentation to create this park. And by 1977, there weren't that many Malaysians doing this sort of work. And I found myself at age 23 appointed as team leader to go and look for rhinos in the Johor part of Endar Rompin Park. And what I found was lots of tapir footprints, but no rhinos. Anyway, with that sort of background, I moved to Sabah in 1979. And within a couple of years, it was very apparent to me, and by the way, I was a staff of WWF Malaysia in Sabah in that time. It became apparent within a couple of years that by far the most endangered species, not only in Malaysia, but in Sabah too, was the Sumatran rhino. It was clear that there were very few left. They're very scattered in number, and really something had to be done. They were the priority species. And so from that sort of time, around 1980, I really set my heart on Sumatran rhinos as the key endangered species in Malaysia that needed attention.
All right. And in Sabah, when you first moved here in Sabah, and I'm assuming that was in the late 70s and early 80s, what did you know much about rhinos then? And what did you learn? How did you get involved? And what was the situation like then?
There's several elements to that story. I mean, the obvious one to me is that most of Sabah, I'd say 75 to 80% of Sabah's land area in that era, was still under forest cover. There's a little bit of oil palm, but not much then. And the sort of the talk of the town, the talk of everyone was to do with logging. And what we now call tropical rainforest, in that time was called timberland, because the forests of Sabah were seen as a source of timber. And they were. Every year, 10 or 12 million cubic meters of wood were exported to Japan from the natural forests. So the whole sort of atmosphere and flavor was not agriculture, it was more forests, forestry, logging, timber, and the wealth that could be made from timber. So that was probably the main thing that I have in my mind. Another was that there was, I think it's fair to say, almost zero interest from anyone in the wildlife of Sabah. Maybe one or two foreigners like myself, but within Sabah, it was this is not blaming anyone, but it was an era where no one really thought about wildlife. It just wasn't an issue. But having said that, I think it's fair to say that a certain segment of society were interested, in this case, in rhinos. The fact that they were very, very rare, they're going to go extinct probably, and something had to be done. But the general feeling was wildlife is of no interest really to anyone. It's only slightly odd people who would be interested in Sumatran rhinos.
When was your first viewing of a Sumatran rhinoceros in Sabah?
My first viewing of a rhino in Sabah was purely by luck. It was in August 1983, and it was in the middle of what is now Tabin Wildlife Reserve. At that time, it was part of the Sabah Foundation logging concession, and I was with a team of botanists from the Forest Department's FRC, Forest Research Centre at Sepilok, and we were actually doing a sort of a list of tree species in Tabin. And as often the way with wildlife, without particularly looking for rhinos, that was the first sighting. And it was, as rhinos do, in its wallow in the middle of the day, the hot time of the day. Sumatran rhinos wallow in liquid mud, largely to cool off. And both before that date and after, I never saw a rhino. I mean, looking for them, because they were so rare, right? They were so rare that looking for them was a waste of time. And the second time would have been when they were in captivity, quite a lot later on, when an early attempt at captive breeding was started in the mid-1980s in Sabah.
Yeah, and rhinos, right? When I first moved to Tawau around 9 years ago, you told me once, you jokingly remembered something, and you told me once there was a rhino shot at the Semporna Kunak junction in the 1971 or 1981. How did you, at that time, get all these notes and ideas, or were you being informed that, there's a rhino has been shot? Were people looking for you already whenever there was rhino-related work or information out there?
I can answer that question with two comments, one specific, one general. The specific one was that it was arranged in 1979 that there would be a program of surveying wildlife. We called it fauna at that time, wildlife. It would be arranged with the Sabah Forestry Department. And the Sabah Forestry Department kindly granted a room and a typist in the Forest Department of Sabah, in Sandakan, for this program, WWF Malaysia Wildlife Survey Program. And it's the way of human nature. I suppose after a couple of years, people would see me every day in the canteen, and it was widely assumed that I was a rather strange member of the department, or a volunteer, like one of these volunteers. And so I was accepted as a member of the department informally, although formally I was never a government staff. And it meant that I had access to government files, which of course is somewhat improper. And I didn't do it improperly. I would ask to see files relating to elephant, rhino, tambadao, those sort of things, right? And so I found in one of those files that a policeman, a police field force policeman, stationed at a junction that's still there. There's the junction, the T junction that's Semporna, Tawau in one direction, off to Lahadatu in the other. At that time, there was a police checking station. It was all surrounded by forest, by the way. There's nothing else, it was forest. A police general routine checking station. And that in 1968, a rhino had come out of the forest and wandered into the road at that T junction, and the policeman had shot it. I mean, you can imagine what happened, right? He saw a rhino, a horn sticking on its nose, and he shot it. And as a policeman, he sort of knew probably nothing bad would happen to him. And in the event that's what happened, his excuse was that it was a danger and might have charged him, so he shot it. But that was in the file. Whether that file still exists or it's been destroyed, I have an idea.
Well, so now it's recorded.
But that's the specific one, right? But there is a more general picture, which, giving another sort of anecdote, and something I will still tell younger people. So say you're driving along the road anyway, it could be in a forest reserve or oil palm plantation, right? You say, I'd like to stop and ask those men over there, have they seen any, now it would be elephants, right, not rhinos, have they seen any elephants recently? And the driver or my young colleague will say, oh, we already did that last year. The answer is no. You need to constantly be on the lookout for information. And what I'd say is, number one, the best source tends to be old men. Nothing sexist about that. They tend to have been around 20, 30, 40 years out in the sticks, in the field, right? So if they know something, it'll be them, not someone in the town, right? So you tend to ask the old men. And the other, even more generally, is any source of information. Most information, I'd say, of interest to us, in this conversation anyway, comes purely by random meetings. If you do a work plan and then go and say, I'm going to interview all these people, you can do it, you might come up with nothing. So the gist of the story is always be on the lookout for sources of information, whether that be old files, old men, groups of people in the village or at a meeting. Just ask, and that's when you'll get the anecdotal but most interesting information very often.
Yeah. So it's 2025 now. Sadly, the Sumatran rhinoceros in Malaysia and Borneo, Malaysian Borneo, is extinct. There are reports of a few individuals, perhaps in the Kalimantan forests, which is not viable and not sustainable. One, I think, is in captivity.
Right.
When did you first realize the Sumatran rhino in Malaysia, and specifically in Sabah, Borneo, is in trouble? And what did you do about it then?
Probably there was not exactly one specific moment, but I can give some anecdote. In 1980 already, so I'd only been in Sabah a year then, right? In 1980, and because I, as a WWF officer, was in the forest department with forestry officers, I was beginning to think rhinos are doomed, right? The only way probably would be through catching them and captive breeding.
No, because you once mentioned they were already one of the most critically endangered mammals in the 1930s in Malaysia. Did you know about that when you first started?
Yes, I did. I'm hesitant a little bit because, at that time, the amount of information one could bring in was very limited, right? If you want information of that sort, 1930s, the species was endangered, the only way would be to go to a library, and there may not be any library in Sabah. It might have to be the University of Malaya library, for example, to find out. So information was very limited. So, like I said, I think I can't imagine a particular moment. I sort of knew the species was endangered. Anyway, my point here was that it was sort of becoming clear to me, not in a flash of inspiration, but just by thinking over the weeks and months, this species is going to go extinct unless there's a captive breeding program. Now, there I can comment a little bit, in that WWF had been founded in the 1960s, and in those early days there was very much a pure focus on saving endangered wildlife. Nowadays it's a much broader remit, but that was the focus. And it was sort of well known in the circles I mixed in the 1960s, 70s even, that if you want to save critically endangered large animals from extinction, the way to do it is captive breeding. Now we don't think that, right? I mean, we may think about it, but it's not our first port of call. It's not the thing we think of immediately.
What would be the first call of thought now? Would you think, let them be in the wild, reduce poaching, reduce this and that? Or
Well, you've introduced a big story now.
Yeah.
The first port of call will be the very wrong assumption that endangered species are endangered by habitat loss and poaching. That's very, very rarely true. And I mean, just to summarize, I'd say wherever you look in the world, most of the habitat that's going to be lost is already lost. It's too late to blame habitat. It's a convenient excuse to blame habitat loss when it's already lost.
And for fundraising, maybe.
Well, that's just slightly cynical, but you're right. It's a good fundraising gambit. We're going to save the habitat. And poaching, this is a slight digression. I'll come back to the rhino story maybe. Poaching, it's great, but it's limited. So if you want to stop poaching, what you're doing, you're trying to slow down the speed at which animals die. Now we all die, right? Any animal dies, so they're going to die. If you reduce poaching, it means you're giving animals a longer life. But crucially, that's doing nothing about fertility or fecundity, births of babies, right? It does nothing to address that. And I mean, I want to make this point very clearly, right? That the sort of secret, in a way, to reversing trajectory of very endangered species is to pay attention to their demography, that's male and female ratio, different age classes, and reproduction of babies. This is the crucial thing you need to look at. Not so much whether an animal's dying at age 5 or 7, doesn't really matter. Anyway, I want to just go back a little bit to the Sumatran rhino before I lose the plot. So, whereas in the early 1980s, it was not unusual to imagine preventing an extinction by captive breeding, it was getting to be out of fashion, out of favor, in favor of setting aside protected areas, new parks, fielding teams to stop poaching. That was the fashion of the time. And even though I give two examples, the European bison and the Arabian oryx had been saved from definite, sure extinction over the previous few decades by captive breeding. And so it would seem obvious. Nowadays it doesn't seem obvious, but in that area, captive breeding of endangered species was fairly obvious. But to continue this story, the Forest Department wrote the letter to IUCN, International Union of Conservation of Nature, which the previous year, 1979, had established an Asian rhino specialist group to advise on Asian rhinos. So that
Does it still exist?
Yeah, it still exists. It still exists. We may come onto that later, but we may not, to avoid embarrassment. That group wrote back and advised, no, we're not in favor of captive breeding. Create a protected area for the rhino instead. Which at the time, I was quite young, right? It sort of made sense. And IUCN had put this in a letter, in writing. And incredibly, within 3 or 4 years, the government of Sabah agreed to the establishment of what is now Tabin Wildlife Reserve. As I mentioned, it had been a logging concession, right? But the Sabah government agreed in 1984 to make a 1,200 square kilometer protected area for rhinos. The reason given was for rhinos, to prevent the extinction of rhinos.
For the people's information and even my own knowledge, were you an integral part of the whole process when Sabah government decided to produce Tabin? I mean, were you busy running around, arranging meetings or writing letters to have Tabin as a rhino reserve?
That's another intriguing point. So my simple answer, yes, I was an integral part. But I did have it easier because really the only people I had to convince was Sabah Forestry Department. Sabah Wildlife Department didn't exist yet. And by the way, Sabah Wildlife Department was created a few years later because of the mess that Sabah had got itself into by withdrawing from an international program for captive breeding, which more later perhaps. So Forest Department were the only people that I had to deal with. WWF was just me, one person. There was no one else. There was no other NGO. There was no other
Really?
NGO. So I was so fortunate.
So in the early 80s, the Sabah NGO scene was John Payne
Yes,
and a
me
few
on behalf
others.
of WWF.
Yeah, that's it. Okay.
So, I mean, the blessing for me was it meant I didn't have any stakeholder meetings. I would talk to Forest Department. You know, as I hinted, I was sort of part of the scenery. I was accepted as a slightly strange officer in the department. And if they wanted advice onto wildlife, they'd come to me and I'd give it. Even though I was only less than 30 years old and a foreigner, but it was given and taken. And that was it. When I look back, I was very fortunate in that. Seriously, in that sense, right, that I didn't have to go through the rigmarole. This is a good old English expression, the rigmarole of many years of consultation with many stakeholders.
And now we have so many NGOs in Sabah, which is good, I suppose, for conservation in general, but there are different viewpoints everybody is listening to, which can slow down. But going back to the topic of 1980s, so you knew you and the authorities, some of them at least, said captive breeding is the way forward. Did Sabah government jump on the idea? Did they support this initiative to catch rhinos? Was WWF backing you fully as well to catch the rhinos and we try to breed them or have a place? Would you say?
I'm smiling because I'm going to say something political. The director of forestry at that time, the late Kadir Mastan, and the chief minister of that time, still alive, Tan Sri Haris Saleh, were both very supportive. But it was quick. There wasn't months. It's just a letter. Yeah, we like this idea. Go ahead. That was it. So simple. And based on that support, when in 1984, there was an international meeting convened by IUCN in Singapore Zoo. It was agreed there would be an international program to save the Sumatran rhino, involving, of course, not only Sabah, but Peninsula Malaysia, Indonesia, and international donors. In 1985, a new government came into Sabah, a new state government. And essentially, as I saw it at the time, their view was anything the previous government had agreed, we will reject. And they did. So a year later, 1986, it was formally agreed that Sabah would withdraw from the International Sumatran Rhino Conservation Program, do it alone, and the government formed a committee. They formed a committee to look into the issue. And not surprisingly, with the committee had no idea what to do, and their recommendation was to set up a new department, the Sabah Wildlife Department, to make sure the Sumatran rhino was saved from extinction, and the rest is history.
Yes. So, however, speaking of history, the rest is supposed to be history. We hoped the rhino would have been saved. It's 2025. The rhino is gone, sadly, in Malaysia, Sabah, Sarawak. What would you say is the main reason of extinction of the Sumatran rhinoceros in Sabah?
I'd love to give you a very simple reply, and I can give a few more insights. I would say the main reason of all is the insufficiency of global, not only Malaysian or Sabahan, global arrangements nowadays on how to tackle endangered species. That whole structure, if I may put it that way, or ecosystem, the human ecosystem to save endangered species is dysfunctional, non-functional. We have International Union for Conservation of Nature, which is run largely by bureaucratic people. And they're very heavily influenced by governments, what governments are going to say. So there's a big element of risk aversion, not only in individual governments, but in international structures like IUCN. So essentially, the whole system is set up to be risk averse, go on for years before making a decision, and then making a compromise decision. That may not be the answer you wanted, but this is what I would point to as the reason it went extinct. Because, and part two of this response is that the Sumatran rhino was critically endangered in the 1980s, right? But technically it was still possible to save it. That could have been done by Indonesia, Peninsula Malaysia, and Sabah working together. They could have forced the donors to put the money into useful things rather than glamour projects. And
I'm sure you tried. I'm sure you tried to convince them.
I did, and several other people do. I would like to credit, if I may, the late Thomas Foos, who was, in a way, the global initiator of that program. He was actually the conservation officer for the American Association of Zoo Parks. I want to just pick on that, right? Because I know that it's sort of quite fashionable nowadays to be down on zoos. And I sort of see why many people have that view. But actually, the big push, from someone maybe it was me to some extent, but the big push globally to save the Sumatran rhino from extinction came from the American Association of Zoos, actually, not from IUCN or WWF or the other mainstream organizations.
All right, okay. And let's get into simpler terms. Do you think the rhino, Sabah government, Peninsula, Indonesia, because these are the three main areas where the rhinos were, do you think bureaucracy was a big problem in the rhino going extinct as well? Would you say Indonesia was not very cooperative, or Sabah was not cooperative? Do you think this was an important part of the rhino extinction timeline?
Bureaucracy was important, but let me try and unpack that a little bit. It's easy to summarize and just say it's bureaucracy. So one element would be that sort of general bureaucratization of processes you see at state, Malaysian, ASEAN, global level, not only in conservation in general. I see that process has happened. But as part of that system, what one has seen is you tend to get, so you have roles, right? You have a sort of director of this, or a conservation officer, or there's some sort of structure in place. But what tends to happen is I put this bluntly, you get a collection of the wrong people. So you might get a biologist, but they might have experience of, and I'm deliberately not focusing on particular people in my mind that I blame, but you might get an African rhino specialist advising on Asian rhinos. Everything is different, right? African rhinos are out in the plains. You know, as a lad, I used to watch primitive documentaries in black and white color of people translocating white rhinos from a helicopter. No, that here we have rainforest. South Africa has a long tradition of private farmers farming wildlife. Here, there's no such tradition. So you might get who seems to be the right person in the job, but they're not. And then you might get someone who's not a biologist at all. You know, you might decide you want a lawyer or a human resources person in that role who has no understanding of biology. So you build up a system which is immediately dysfunctional because it's populated by, frankly, it's populated by maybe 1 in 20 or 1 in 50 people who really know what they're talking about. But they then have to end up not being supported by, they end up having to argue and convince other people who might have come in and have their own ideas. And it's very draining, as you can imagine, right? You do that year after year, decade after decade, and then all that whole cohort of people retires or resigns. You get a whole other cohort of people who don't really know what they're talking about, but come in to advise me, in this case.
But it must be frustrating because it takes time and there's not much time, or was much time, to save the
No, it's
species.
another thing, right? I mean, it's another... I'm sure some famous philosophers have sort of said this, but people get used to the society and system they live in, and the days and months go by. Sometimes you need a decision tomorrow, yes or no, we'll go ahead. If we don't go ahead, that's it, forget about it.
Yeah.
But it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
The months and years go by and no decisions are made.
So rhinos, when you had them also, when you were trying to save them, you put them together in facilities in Payne and other places, in the 80s, in the 90s and so on. Would you say one of the biggest problems was they were not breeding? And if they were not, why were they not breeding? What was the problem there? Why were the Sumatran rhinos in Sabah not breeding?
Whoa. So again, I'd like to give a simple answer, and it's not that simple, of course, but let me offer a few basically biological things. Number one is the issue of time is important. So in that era, 1980s, that was the beginning of this era, what people maybe should have realized but didn't is most of the wild rhinos were disproportionately old rhinos, right? So whereas if you'd gone back 200 years earlier, you go into rhino country and they'd have males and females equal ratio. A third of the animals were fertile females having babies every 3 years. By the 1980s, you might get 2 males there, 1 female there. But what that led up to, what was clear by around year 2000, was that this is really, sounds very technical but very critical, most female Sumatran rhinos by the 1980s could not have babies anymore. They had cysts, fibroids and growths in their reproductive system. And that was to do with a simple biological thing. There were no males and they hadn't bred. So you might have a 10-year-old female Sumatran rhino had never seen a male in her life.
So when you put them in captivity, I'm sure they all had a shocker as well.
Well, okay, I'll come on to that. But what I wanted to say was they were reproductively compromised. And it turned out, and now we know now in the 2020s that at least 70, probably 90% of all female rhinos in the 1980s could not have babies anymore. They were females, but they couldn't have babies because they were reproductively in very poor condition. But on the thing you alluded to, the more specific of putting a male and female together, there was another problem. So the reproductive pathology, as it's called, and human women get it as well, it's called fibroids, right? Very often, if you don't have babies, you build up these tumors in the uterus. It's a mammalian issue. So that's a physiological issue. But then, when you put a male and female rhino together, not only is that one there, there's a behavioral problem. And yet again, it's because I think even 100 years ago, the rhino was very, very rare, so people didn't really know anything about its behavior. But what it turns out that, well, now we can work back and see that historically, male Sumatran rhinos would fight each other, literally. You know, like black rhinos or Indian rhinos or any big herbivore, you know, deer, antelopes, the males come to, you've seen these pictures,
Yes.
right, of them fighting, right? So in the old days, that would have happened. You might have 3 or 4 males fighting each other, and seriously fighting, right? They're big animals, they'd whack each other. And so the male would be keyed up, right? He'll be in a sort of aggressive mood. But historically, and now we can only do this by thinking back what would have happened, right? The female would have been there. So the males would come, they would be drawn to a female in estrus, right? They'd be drawn in, and they would know that by sniffing the feces. So the feces would have a combination of hormones that showed that this female was in heat, was ready. And that would only happen about once every 25 days. That's another issue which I go into, right? So for 2 days every month, roughly, a female will be in heat. So if you imagine back 1,000 years, right, when there's lots of rhinos, 2 or 3 males would sniff that, come together and fight, and the female would be there. And then a male would start chasing the female, and through evolution, you know, through evolutionary process, the female would then fight the male, right? She knows, in inverted commas, that the male is really going to be quite aggressive. So she would fight back. So it was found in captivity, and this started probably in 1986, 87, at that wave of capture of rhinos, IUCN endorsed. Put a male and female together, they had no idea if she's an estrus. They would fight each other. And it took about 10 years for people both in Sabah, under Dr. Edwin Bosi, and others in American zoos who also got rhinos from Sumatra. They worked out that you can't just put the rhinos together and hope for the best. You need to monitor the estrus cycle, which is not that difficult, it's tedious, but you can do that. Then you would put them together when she's in heat, and you would need to have 3 or 4 tough men with shields and sticks to chivvy them together and force them apart if the aggression got too great. And another thing I must say, you will imagine, of course, if you imagine, so whether this was Sabah or Cincinnati Zoo, didn't matter, you put a male and female together, she's in estrus, so that's fine. But they're in a space the size of the room we're in now, right? So there's nowhere to go, so they continue fighting. In the wild, they would fight, and they'd run away and maybe come back together 10 minutes, 15, 20 minutes later.
After cooling off.
In zoo or captive conditions, right, the brave young men with shields have to go in and forcibly separate them. So that whole thing, and that's not unique in the animal world, but it's very unusual to have such a degree of potential aggression amongst a male and a female. And it took 10, 20 years to realize that, by which time it was also realized the physiological problem was there. So you have those 2 things together.
So thank you for that explanation on how this whole process went and everything. Now I would like to talk a little bit more on something more tough and controversial. So when we were talking about earlier on that the Sumatran rhino in Sabah, for example, was already very rare and critically endangered in the 80s and everything, and maybe a lot of new knowledge came in later on. But if, let's say, yourself or the government or the experts all over the world, if they knew the rhino was already so rare, do you think it was worth putting all that time and effort to save the species in captivity if it was going to go extinct anyways and the money could have been used somewhere else? I mean, did this ever occur to yourself or the others, that is it really worth spending so much money for an animal which is going to go extinct maybe anyways? No,
it's a very fair question. It comes up from time to time with the Sumatran rhino and other species sometimes as well.
Because Sabah still lost it in the end. So,
yes, that's true. So let me take it from that perspective, that all that effort went in over sort of 35, 40 years in Sabah. I'm thinking that through that lens. I would say point number 1 is that in the end, efforts to prevent the extinction of endangered species, whether you like it or not, is down to a few people who are very passionate about it. Government can give the blessing, right? And necessary, they have to give legal permits to catch or whatever, right? But it's up to a small number of passionate individuals to make sure it happens. And my view is if you, and this is not only it's in any field of human endeavor, if you get a small number of passionate people who want to do something, in general, other people should help them and support them. Not necessarily financially, but give them permits, say, that is great, right? So this is my first point. We should not expect to leave these sort of decisions to governments at any level, whether it's state or federal, or even to IUCN. We should leave it to those passionate people. And the other part of this argument is this, that, and then this is perhaps more difficult, but the view that there's a limited amount of money for wildlife conservation and you need to spend it wisely. In my view, that's not correct at all. I mean, there's...
You mean it's not correct to think that way?
Thank you. Not correct to think that way. You could think that way. I mean, you could argue that way. I could imagine you sitting there arguing alternative one. But my argument would be, you start with those passionate people who want to do something. Actually, it's not that often that the same donors will want to catch wild animals and use, say, assisted reproductive technology. That's a different sort of donor from those who want to have a new protected area or do stakeholder consultation or public awareness. You don't necessarily have to go to the same donor. You can argue very, very differently. So my own view is, long story short, is that, well, there's not a limited amount of money. There's an infinite amount, right? Trillions of dollars, since the dollar is still the dominant currency, right? Trillions of dollars swirl around the global financial system every day. You take out 0.0000001%, it may be $100 million. Doesn't mean it's trivial, right? So that's point A. And point B, again, to reiterate, right? It's up to those small group of people to decide how they're going to argue for what they want to argue.
But
for.
maybe I feel like there was like an underlying thing in your point one, that maybe there was not enough support given to people, who were passionate about the topic. They didn't get enough money or support. Do you feel like you didn't get enough permits or support from the authorities or your colleagues as well in the industry? Or would you say there was sufficient support given from Malaysian government?
This is actually a more difficult question, because I will reply. My reply sort of implies I'm blaming a particular person, a particular time and period, or state or federal. It's not so much like that. It's more a sort of lassitude and lack of genuine interest from anyone in the whole story. I mean, for example, I could point the Director of Wildlife could have done more. Yeah, he could have done, but he had lots of other things to deal with. Or the minister of that time might have been more interested in tourism than wildlife. Not to blame them, that's how they were, right? So again, you get this sort of panoply of people, and for them, oh goodness, this thing might not work out. And people are polite, right? Sometimes it's good if people say, no, you're not going to get the money or not going to get the policy, because then you know how to move on, right? The frustration often is having very half-hearted yes or no sort of support over many years.
Yeah. So what can we learn from this extinction of rhinos? Is there still hope, you think, John? Do you think the rhino could still be coming back in the future with all this new development in genetics? I mean, that's one of the things you guys were also trying your best to do, to breed them or have them in labs, or
Okay.
How would you explain it in layman's term, what you were trying to do? And it
Right.
didn't work out so far.
Yeah.
But do you think, is there any hope? You think Sabah would be able to see the rhino again?
All right, there's several questions embedded there. So number one is Sabah will not see this rhino again. It's now too late, definitely. That's the easy question out of the way. Secondly...
Thank you for not being polite. No.
Secondly, I want to make a point about this. So it was probably around a bit earlier, but the focal year was 2011, when the Leibniz Institute of Zoo and Wildlife Research in Berlin came to Sabah. They'd been to Sabah before, but they came with the blessing of the Wildlife Department and the minister to try and boost the chances of saving the species through assisted reproductive technology, which means collecting sperm out of males, put them under general anesthesia, get it out. Same with females, under general anesthesia, getting eggs out, put them together in the lab to make in vitro embryos, which is not a new technique, right? I mean, tens of thousands of humans living on the world have been produced in that way. So the idea that 2011 this was to try the same with the Sumatran rhino. So I'd say this, it was in desperation rather than mad scientists in white coats wanting to create monsters. It wasn't. It was in desperation that, what on earth are we going to do to save this animal, right? So that was the origin of this thing. I should, as part of that answer, credit the national government of Malaysia, which in 2015 up to 2021 financially supported that work, assisted reproductive technology for rhinos and other species as well. Rhino was the focus, but they put the money into other species. And in the end, it didn't work, partly technically there were not enough rhinos left, right? There was just not enough left. Partly there wasn't international support. I have to focus on Indonesia particularly. There was no interest from Indonesia to collaborate in this work. I think now there would be. I mean, another...
You think, or is it you just...
No, as an aside, but you know, an aside, I want to make an important point. There's an element of luck in historical context. So sometimes you get, you know, the right alignment of people in positions of power in two nations, but we didn't. Anyway, suffice that to say that the idea of assisted reproductive technology was done in desperation, because that seemed to be one, as they say now, one tool in the box. And it was sad that Indonesia didn't want to collaborate.
So if you mean in terms of desperation, do you think if we started in the 80s, it would have, you would have had some...
It would have worked.
Possibly.
It would have worked, yes.
So before we go into the final section of our chit-chat today, another controversial topic. Do you think governments in this part of the world, whether it's Indonesia, Sabah, Peninsula Malaysia, or worldwide, do you think they misled the public? Because it's a common phenomena where government officials sometimes say, oh, there are 80 rhinos, or there are 150 tigers in the wild. Yes. But maybe the number might be a quarter of that. Yes. Maybe not 80 rhinos, 20 rhinos. This might be because the civil servant just want to keep his job until they retire, so the next person gets the blame. Do you think there was a bit of misleading to the public by politicians or civil servants? Which
you almost took the words out of my mouth. So one could see with the Sumatran rhino, and one can sort of see it a little bit with endangered species now. I will point to, so in the Malaysian context, each country will be a bit different, right? But in the Malaysian context, there's only 3 people who really count in this whole topic, right? We should stop victim blaming or blaming ourselves for things that went wrong. There were 3 people who should have stepped up and never did. One would be, of course, Sabah, and there's a complication in Malaysia, right? You have Peninsula Malaysia and Sabah, but leaving that aside, the 3 people are the minister. The minister should make it his job. He may be a busy man with political issues, right? He should make it his job to find out what is the real story and what needs to be done. And he will then rely on what in Sabah we call the permanent secretary, in Peninsula Malaysia they call the Ketua Setiausaha, right? The chief secretary, the head of the civil service for that topic, in our case wildlife. And the third one is the director general. In Sabah will be director, West Malaysia will be director general, the person in charge of wildlife. So those 3 gentlemen, and they've all been men, by the way, they have the privilege and the obligation to decide what the issues are and how to solve them. What they've done successively is extreme risk avoidance, pretend things are sort of okay, they're working on it, and wait for the next minister or the next director general to take the blame if the species goes extinct. This is what I see. It may be very cynical, but it's it's an extremely important part of the story. We cannot assume public awareness or passionate people alone can do the job. It's up to those 3 people to make those hard decisions. And very, very rarely do you see those people making those right decisions.
So, rhino is gone, sadly. Which other species in Sabah and in Malaysia could be facing the same fate as a rhino? So, what other? So, my question is basically, which other species at similar risk? Do they have any hope left?
All right.
So we can save the time
for the future.
For the future.
So I could talk at length, but seriously, okay, let's put it this way. Some species that people are worried are critically endangered aren't really. You know, if there's thousands of individuals left in protected areas, they're not really, I mean, they're going to last another 50, 100 years before you need to worry, right? I'm going to pick on 3 species that are critically endangered in my view, an action is needed. So there's two examples which are least known. The two wild cattle species, the wild cows of Malaysia. In Sabah, it's the Bornean banting, usually known as tambadau locally. In Peninsula
Stocking
Malaysia,
putih.
yes,
Some people
they have
call
a
it stocking
stocking puti and a pantat puti, or buntut, as I should say.
Yes.
In Peninsula Malaysia, it's the seladang. Same thing, but it's bigger and it has a dark-coloured backside, not pale. And those two species, I think the main thing I'd highlight is this. Because they're regarded as just cows, which they are, they're cattle, right? People think, oh, maybe they're just sort of feral cows that went wild. No, they're not. They're genuine part of the Malaysian fauna, banting in Sabah, seladang in West Malaysia. And for that reason, they're just cows. They do not get the attention they deserve.
Even when tourists see them, they'll be like another cow, even though it might be
exactly.
super rare,
And
rarer than another.
Maybe the guide is not really sure if it's
Yeah.
a wild cow or not. Anyway, in my view, it's fortunate. This is a biological point, right? It's fortunate that both those species live in herds. So they don't have the rhino problem, right? They live in herds, so the bulls and cows, the cows usually have some auntie and some nephews and nieces, right? So they're in a group. So the problems that with the Sumatran rhino, a solitary species, are ameliorated. They're not so severe, right? If you look at a herd of seladang or banting, there's usually one or two babies there. But that's on the good side. The bad side is that there are very, very few herds left. The number of herds is growing less over the years. And I can demonstrate from our experience in Sabah, the size of the herd is getting smaller. I mean, if you look at that, you should worry, right? It means they're not breeding enough. There's less herds and the size of the herd is getting smaller.
All right. I think we'll need to have a bunting discussion another time, because this will be a long discussion on how we need to save the species now. So you think bunting is the thing in Sabah,
Yes.
seladang. Which other species in Sabah would you think? And in Malaysia. So I'll give you one for Sabah, one for Malaysia. Which one do you think we need to focus on at risk?
Let me go for the Peninsula Malaysia first, because the Sabah one is there's pros and cons of various species. Peninsula Malaysia, leaving aside the seladang, right, would be the tiger, and that really is rather similar to the Sumatran rhino. Not in their diet, right? Rhinos eat leaves, tigers eat animals,
Meat, yes.
but in terms of being naturally sparse, I mean, you're never going to see loads together, right? Naturally sparse, solitary animals like the Sumatran rhino. So one sort of sees the same syndrome with the tiger. There aren't that many, and in a sense, whether there's 50 or 100 or 200 doesn't really fully matter. What we know is they're very, very sparsely scattered. We know from camera trap images that the females are breeding, but not that often, right? They're only having maybe 2, maybe 3 births per female every 5 or 6 years, right? So we can, if we think, we can see a very slow decline in the number and concentration of tigers like we did with the Sumatran rhinos. Tigers, to be sure, are not as bad as the Sumatran rhino was 50 years ago. Tigers are more like maybe Sumatran rhinos 60 or 70 years ago.
But however, my personal opinion is I think the tigers are going to be doomed. And I don't think, they're going to go extinct.
Well, if you'll forgive me, I'm going to add a little bit more on the tigers. I see that despite the enormous amount of effort and time and money, even at ministerial level, I mean, for many years, right? We must save the tiger, we do this, do that. Public awareness doesn't make any difference. Putting up bridges on roads doesn't make any difference, right?
A school talk and a poster doesn't make a difference.
This is the key point. Maybe I should jump to the key point. The key point is tigers are not evolved to eat dogs or goats or frogs or mice. They've evolved to eat large-bodied animals. I can put it in a sort of Mickey Mouse way to say they're very big because they need big animals to eat.
Need payau rusa.
Precisely. You took the words out of my mouth. The key diet of tigers is rusa, samba deer, maybe kijang, but basically big deer and pigs. Those are their two keys in their diet. Now, if you look in Peninsula Malaysia, and this is not new, everyone knows this, the number of rusa is very, very, very low. One reason is they're not a hill forest animal, and most of the forest left in Malaysia is hill forest, so they're not really a forest animal, samba deer. The other, there's been rural people, not recently, from way back in the British time, almost every kampong would have at least one gun from the 19th century. And the prime target of rural Malay people from the 19th century was rusa. That was their target, right? So the number of rusa in Peninsula is extraordinarily low. It's extremely depressed. They're almost as depressed as tigers are. So rusas are almost out as tiger prey as of now. And then, as you will perhaps recall, 2021, 2022, there was something called the African swine fever, which swept through Southeast Asia.
All the puppies are
decimated
gone, yeah.
Not only domestic, but most wild pigs were wiped out in that. So the population of pigs is depressed. So the reason in the last few years that tigers come out and eat people, dogs, and get run over is because they're coming out looking for food. There's no food in the forest. The single big thing that can save the Malayan tiger from extinction is to have a program that boosts the productivity of natural prey. Not just put a few out, but have a big program.
Hundreds and thousands of deer, throw them in the jungle.
Yes, you need to provision with food, or you want to breed them in captivity and release them, provision food, create feeding grounds of natural grass, whatever, but do it. This is the program that's needed. And it's just starting. Luckily in Pahang, I have to put in a plug for the Pahang royal family who've established the Sultan Al Abdullah Royal Tiger Reserve. They are frankly the only people in Malaysia that have switched on to this idea of we need to boost the prey animals of tiger.
Well, that's very good to know. We have royal support, government support. We'll save that for another session. The final 2 points I would like to discuss and share, ask you. What would your message be to other young Sabah, Han, or Bornean conservationists regarding the future? Because, I feel like there are not enough young people, that's my personal opinion, not enough young people doing conservation in Sabah. So what do you think young people, what is your message for young people in Sabah? How can they be more involved? What can they do to help general conservation? Not just Sabah, actually, young Bornean conservationists. What is your message to them?
Okay, I've got a message that is not very crisp, but it's in several bits. So number one, I think we accept that most people will never be interested, right? You can give awareness, but it's only going to be a small number of people that have that passion. That's number one, right? Don't try to force yourself if you're not interested. Number two would be a quotation from an old Irish playwright, George Bernard Shaw. Those who can't change their mind cannot change anything. I mean, that you could rephrase that in every way you like, right? But a general message will be, if you're in that position of a young person who is passionate, right, what's your thing, don't be afraid to have a different opinion. Do not assume that everyone senior, I won't mention ministers or directors again, but do not imagine they know what they're talking about, have the answers. Think for yourself. It's difficult in Asian society, but have your own opinion, and that opinion, point number three, your opinion critically should be based on an independent assessment. And it may be you just need to know a bit of biology and maths, right? I mean, if you want tigers to have a litter of 3 every year and a half, you need to give them lots of meat. It's not rocket science, right? They need to learn that nutrition, a little bit of compound interest to know, can you double the population in 25 years if you have that sort of birth rate of 5% per year of the population. Learn those sort of things and apply that, have your own view, and then tell people about it.
All right.
So the main thing is courage and bravery, really.
Thank you. That's a good advice to the young Bornean conservationists. The last point, John, because we can go on for 5 more hours, I think. We have multiple topics to discuss. What is next for John Payne? You have been doing this for decades now, 47, 50 years in Sabah alone. You outlive most of us over here as well. What is next for you? Are you going to slow down? Or are you more motivated than ever? Are you more cynical than ever? Are you more sad than ever? How do you not only do you feel now, but what is next for you, John? Because you have so much knowledge, wisdom. You've seen successes. You've seen setbacks. The other conservationists who could lead your guidance as well. I learn from you all the time. So, but what is next for you, John?
I thank you for that gracious points you made. I as you will have gathered, right, I'm quite into, I'd say, a scientific approach, right, probability. So the chances are I'll be dead in 10 years or so. That's what I have to assume, right? Maybe earlier.
I hope 20, not 10.
So this is rather nasty to say, but
It's okay.
governments and the big NGOs will always be the same. All right. I mean, as I've said earlier, right? I don't want to blame any particular people. The system, the ecosystem, is not geared to do this sort of work we want to do. One has to hope for passionate, predominantly young people, and they tend. It's very difficult to operate as individuals. There's a few who can do that, but almost all of us operate through an NGO, one way or another.
Well,
right?
it's not sustainable to be just solo.
Financially or
Yeah, and then, because if you're finished,
sure.
you're done.
You need so I'm looking to small niche NGOs or social enterprises. Doesn't have to be purely not-for-profit. Small groups of passionate people with some legal institutional arrangement to be the force that's necessary. So anyway, with that background, I see my task really as, given my life expectancy is going to get less every year, my task is to try and influence and persuade these other small, more niche NGOs, institutions to adopt the things that I think need to be done. So it'd be nutrition, thinking outside the box, maybe captive breeding, but usually not. That's a last-ditch one. Think of those sort of things and apply them on the ground. So in summary, my role is really to try and get out these messages to younger people who are equally passionate. Think out the box, don't just follow the flow, and do some of those projects. I mean, it could be planting grass for elephants, breeding pigs for tigers, it could be anything.
So you're still motivated?
Yes, in a word, still motivated.
Okay, so that's what we wanted to know. The good to know. I hope a lot of other people will know that even being 5 decades in this field, you're still motivated, and that's a great thing. So John Payne, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
And effort. So I hope we'll stay tuned for the next episode on Borneo conservation related topics, and we'll hopefully bring some very interesting people and topics to be discussed over the next few episodes. So thank you very much.